Today we're going to introduce you to the subject of social psychology and in particular look at a couple of what are often called intuitive theories of human it's not just about behavior, observable behavior, but we're also interested in what people think and how they feel, and in particular how all those things in one person can be influenced by other people. So a lot of people think of social psychology as being about big groups like sports teams or groups of fans, but actually social psychology is crucial to understanding the individual's behavior as well, because they're influenced by other people. And sport is a fundamentally social experience. Humans are ultimately fundamentally social animals, and that's a really important theme that's going to run through this first part of the unit. And sport itself is very social. Obviously, team sports are very social. It's at the very nature of them, because a lot of you even actually play team sports, at least partly because of the social benefits you get from being part of a sports team, for the social crack and camaraderie as much as for the actual sport activity that you like to play. So team sports are clearly very important to the social psychologist, but even individual sports are very social as well. You know, when you compete in sport, you compete against somebody else, whether it's one person or lots of people in your sport. The fact is, it is still a social experience. Your interactions with your coach, and for example, people that you might be training with, such as a training partner in the gym, are social experiences as well. Okay, so if we want to understand people's behaviour in sport, we have to understand a bit about social psychology and how people interact. So today we're going to look at two key theories that social psychologists have used to try to understand social behaviour. The first is a thing called schema theory, and then we're going to look at attitudes as well. So first thing to point out is that according to social psychologists, human beings essentially are all behaving like amateur scientists. Okay? In fact, in a sense, we all behave like amateur psychologists, because people are usually interested in why other people do the things that they do, behave the way they do, think the way they do, etc. Okay? And to do that, what people do is follow a number of steps that are very similar to what scientists often do. They collect data, they look at what other people do, and talk to them or hear about what they think. They try to determine what goes with what, and they try to infer cause and effect relationships between things that they see, between, for example, people's behaviours and outcomes, to try to figure out the best way to behave in a certain situation and, for instance, become an excellent sports performer. So, for instance, we often see that people can observe certain things that champions might do. They might assume that their success is due to those things, and therefore they copy that behaviour because they've inferred a cause and effect. Whether there is a real cause and effect relationship is another thing. There may not be. So, for example, you might assume that a champion has become a champion because of the way they train or because of a nutritional supplement that they say they take, and therefore you copy that person thinking that that's what's led to their success. But of course, in reality, there could be many, many things that have contributed towards their success that you don't see. Now, schemas then depend on this kind of amateur scientific sort of process that we go through. And the idea of a schema is based on two things. The first assumption is that our expectations and our preconceptions can bias how we perceive people. And the second one is that our memories are simplified reconstructions of our original perceptions. And that might not make a lot of sense at the moment, but we'll go through and look at examples that hopefully will make this clear. Now, schemas themselves, I think this definition by Atkinson is a pretty good one, are essentially a set of organised beliefs and knowledge that we hold. Now, that might be about other people, it might be about things, it might be events, and it could be situations that we see. So it's a set of beliefs basically about things going on around us. Now, we engage then in what we call schematic processing, and that basically is where we try to search for a schema that's most consistent with the information that's coming into us. This is a subconscious process. It happens very quickly, and it enables us to process efficiently lots of information that is coming in. So effectively, what we do is we form a schema about a person or a situation. We get new information in about that person, and we tend to link it to the schema that we've already formed. Okay? So for instance, let's say we watch an individual playing a sport that we're interested in or that we play, and we don't think they've performed very well. We might form a schema that says that person isn't very good, such as watching a striker that's signed for the football team you support, and you say, that player's not very good because the first time you see them, they don't play very well. Now, this is often referred to as the primacy effect, and that is the power of first impressions. So you form a schema about somebody within a few seconds of meeting them. You form, without knowing necessarily anything much about them, an instant impression, and that immediately starts to form the basis of your schema. So in this case, your schema is that this new signing is a bit of a dud. He or she isn't really a very good striker. Okay? Then what happens is, when we get more information about that performer, we tend to assimilate it into the schema we've already formed. Schemas are very, very resistant to change. They tend to bias what we think in the future. So if we form an initial impression that that player isn't very good, if then we see them playing again and again they have a bad game, we don't think, maybe that player's carrying an injury, or maybe they're not feeling very well, or maybe they're just not getting service in the way that, for example, they would ideally like, or being told to play in the way that they like. We assume that, they're not a very good player because we've already formed that schema. Okay, so first impressions last, as they say. The first impressions you make on someone are in many ways the most important because they guide everything else. If, on the other hand, the first time you see that player, they play brilliantly, they score a load of goals, you're going to form a schema that says, wow, this is a really good player. And if on the second occasion they don't play as well, you tend to link that back to your schema, which says, but they're a really good player, so you're likely to make excuses for that person or come up with other reasons why they didn't play as well, because your schema says they're a really good player. And we're going to look at examples of this in action in our class today. So schemas, therefore, are very, very important in influencing people's perceptions and their subsequent thoughts and behaviours towards other people. And they're very, very important because, although they're very crude mechanisms, they're essential, because without them it's very, very difficult to make sense of all the different information that we receive about what's going on in the world. So, for instance, if you were walking to uni this morning and somebody comes walking towards you with with a dog, how do you know that's a dog if it's a breed that you've never ever seen before? Well, you know it's a dog because the animal's going to be furry, it's going to be about perhaps knee high, maybe it's barking, it's got a waggy tail, and the chap's walking it on a lead. Well, in that case, that fits with your schema of what a dog is. So without schemas, it's very hard to make sense of the world. But schemas can also be problematic because they can lead us to have stereotypical views of certain people or even groups of people that might have a negative impact. So, for example, maybe it could lead us to have sexist attitudes towards female athletes. For instance, if we form a schema that says, from say, one performer in a sport that says, oh, women aren't good at this sport or whatever, so that you can see, therefore, that schemas can have quite a negative impact in that they can lead to prejudice and stereotyping and some quite negative outcomes. But they are important because without them, without that cognitive device, it would be very hard to make sense of all the information that we get in through our senses. And in addition, attitudes are very, very important as well. In fact, it's one of social psychology's most central concepts, and early researchers in social psychology in the 19th century were fascinated by how people formed their attitudes towards things. It was a really big focus of social psychology, and it still is today, like a couple of 100 years later. So the definition of attitudes, a general and rather stable orientation towards an object, suggests that attitudes are quite sticky. They don't change very easily. So people form certain attitudes, and like in the cartoon, they view these things as kind of certainties in life. Yeah? Because people like to feel that they understand the world and that their attitudes are very much in tune with it. So they become quite deeply ingrained, and as we'll see, can be quite difficult to actually change. The most famous model of attitudes is probably Rosenberg's and Hovland's three-part model, where they argue one part of attitudes is the cognitive part. That's our opinions and beliefs about an object. There's the affective part, whether we like or dislike the object, and then there's our behaviour, which is how we behave towards the object. So, for example, we might hold a cognition that says that smoking's bad for us, but then we might actually enjoy having a cigarette after a meal, say, in which case our action tendencies depend on which of those two is the strongest influence on our behaviour. Or maybe we don't like playing sport in school, for example, if we had a bad experience, and we might form negative attitudes towards school sport. We then have negative affect or negative emotions towards sport, and our behaviour is likely to be that we'll tend to avoid playing sport in the future. Attitudes are hugely important in sport, not just, as I've alluded to, in whether we participate or not, but in how successful we are. When we look at elite level sport, all people at that level have what it takes to be successful. If you didn't have the necessary talents, you would never get anywhere near a professional or an elite level or an international level. However, there's only one person who can win a professional competition. There can only be one world champion at the end of a world championship competition. And one of the things that seems to make a big difference between being that ultra elite level performer and not making it quite at that level is your attitude. So as Muhammad Ali says, although training is necessary to perform at your best, champions aren't made in gyms. They're made from something they have deep inside them. He calls a desire, a dream, a vision. Yeah, you have to have stamina. Yeah, you have to be fast. Yeah, you have to be the skill. But as it says there, the will must be stronger than the skill. And that's all about your attitude. So, for example, if you're in a bad run of form, if you've been defeated a lot, if other things are going wrong in your life, your attitude will have a big impact upon the likely outcome in terms of your longevity in the sport and your likely success. So attitudes is a really important thing for the sports psychologist to understand. So if it's important, then we really need to know about what things influence attitude, and particularly how attitudes are formed. And there's a number of things. There's loads of research. For instance, the famous communications researcher Zhang in his work over many years showed that the amount of exposure to information is hugely important in forming attitudes. That's why advertisers spend very large sums of money on it. It's why politicians spend a lot of money advertising and promoting their views. But we also know there are genetic influences in attitudes, and that some attitudes seem to have a stronger genetic basis than others. How do we know? Well, we know that in certain things, identical twins have a more similar attitude than non-identical twins. Okay, identical twins having identical genetic inheritance, identical DNA, and non-identical twins not having such strong genetic similarity. And we know that attitudes that are more heritable or more easily inherited tend to be stronger and less resistant. That should be more resistant. I've just spotted a mistake there. More resistant to change. Personality is also related to our attitudes. So, for example, people with certain personality traits, such as introverts, are more open to being influenced than extroverts. We'll talk about these particular traits and many others when we look at personality in a few weeks' time. Socialization is really important as well. So children learn, for instance, how to behave and to some extent how to think about different things from their parents and schools, and later on the peer group becomes massively important in terms of influencing people's attitudes. And we also know there is huge peer pressure to conform to our peer group's attitudes, such as shown in a very famous series of studies way back in the 1950s by a psychologist called Solomon Asch. And he had a deceptively simple experiment. In this experiment, an individual would go into a room with a load of other people, and they'd been told that they were going to take part in a series of studies on visual perception. And the people would be shown some cards on a screen or on a piece of paper. And here's an example of one of the cards used in one of Asch's experiments. Now, the card on the left, as you can see, has a black line, a black vertical line, and there are 3 black vertical lines on the card on the right. And the task was simply to match the card on the right, which had the same length as the card on the left. Now you can see here the answer is really obvious, that it's C. Okay, so C, as you can see, is the same length as the line on your left. But here's the interesting thing. When the person started to was asked to examine the line, what they would do, they would go to each person in the group, and unknown to one of the individuals in the room, everybody else in the room was in on the experiment and they were actually the only participant. And other people in the room would start giving the incorrect answer when asked about which line was the correct one. The idea of the experiment was to see whether the person would go with the clear evidence of their own eyes or change their opinion to fit in with the other people in the group. And the interesting thing was that 3/4 of participants in these studies conformed to the group at least once and gave an incorrect answer which fitted in with what other people in the group were saying when it was obvious that the answer was incorrect. So the idea of the study was actually to examine conformity pressure and how when we're in groups of people there are strong pressures on us to adopt the attitudes and behaviours of other people in the group. And in this case, 3/4 of people did, even when it was really obvious that the answer was wrong. So Ash concluded from this that in order to conform, reasonably intelligent and well-meaning people would call white black. So it shows that conformity pressures are very, very strong. Now, obviously the task here is a bit kind of abstract, so the results were replicated many times with different kinds of tasks and always got a similar result. In fact, Ash's experiments to date have been performed in more than 100 countries with lots of different tasks. Now it might be comforting for you to believe, well, I'm not really sheep-like like that, and I don't believe most people are today. These experiments were done a long time ago. Would we still get the same result? Probably not, is what you might think. And you'd be wrong, because actually the research today in recent studies shows very similar results and a similar level of conformity as was shown in Ash's day. But it is important to note that some people do dissent, okay? That some people do stick out for what they think is the correct answer. And also, conformity happens less when the group isn't unanimous. So as soon as one person disagrees, other people find it easier to disagree as well. But conformity is clearly a very, very strong social pressure. Now, Ash realised that conformity was really, really powerful instinct. He understood that it happened, but what we couldn't really understand at that time, because Ash didn't have the tools to examine it, was exactly why it happened. But now, of course, we have brain scanners and other techniques that enable us to actually figure out what's going on in people's brains when they conform or don't conform to the group. And a neuroscientist called Burns a few years ago replicated the Ash work with a slightly different task, in this case a mental rotation task, though this is the task in the diagram here. So you're given a shape, you're then shown various rotated versions of shapes and you have to match them. Okay? Now, while people were doing this task, they were put in a brain scanner. Similar scenario, you had a group who consistently gave the wrong answer, and then you're asked to give your answer. Do you go with the evidence of your own eyes, or do you go with the group? Well, actually, Burns found about the same proportion of people conforming, that is most of them at least once, 3/4 at least once, and 40% pretty much all the time conforming to what the group were saying. So it supports this idea that this conformity effect is stable across time and also seems to be fairly stable across cultures as well. Also, another interesting finding was looking at the people who didn't conform, they had greatly increased activity in the amygdala that processes fear-related information. So the people who didn't conform didn't just do it and found it easy to do, it actually caused their brain to process a very strong fear response. So it's a literally scary thing to stand up and not conform to the group. It's very, very difficult. So Burns suggests that conformity has a very strong and deep rooted evolutionary basis. Now, there's a general assumption that our attitudes determine our behaviours, so the two should be consistent, okay? Such as the cognitive dissonance theory that Festinger came up with in 1954, and we'll talk about some of his fascinating work in class. But the basic idea here is that it's very uncomfortable when your attitudes differ from your behaviour, so you tend to change one or the other so that they match. But actually, it doesn't seem to be quite as simple as that, because there was a lot of research done on attitudes in the early to mid 20th century, and when that research was all examined in detail, we found that on average the correlation between attitudes and behaviour was very low. And one recent study, in fact just a few years ago, that's examined a century of this work, has shown that the correlation between attitudes and behaviour rarely exceeds 0.3, which is a very low relationship between the two. Correlations range from -1 to a maximum of +1, and 0.3 is very low. So in other words, you can't tell how somebody's going to behave from their attitudes towards somebody or something. And that's a really, really important point. Okay, so it suggests that attitudes might be important to understand somebody's psychology, but they can't always tell you how they're going to behave. We need more information, and that's ultimately what's probably important. Attitudes involve what people think or feel about how they'd like to behave towards something, but how you really behave isn't just determined by what you'd like to do, but also by what you think you probably should do, such as social norms, by what you've done in the past, by your habits, which are really, really strong and can have a big influence on your behaviour, and by what you think will happen if you behave that way. So, therefore, behaviour is about a lot more than just attitude, although attitude is one part of it, and it's an important part of understanding the psychology of a human being.